Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We're going to give individuals a few more minutes. We'll give them a couple minutes to join, and then we'll begin with today's program. So welcome to those who are joining us right now. We're giving everyone a couple minutes, one more minute just to join, and we'll be respectful of everyone's time. So just to be respectful of everyone's time, we'll begin and more people will be coming in. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's program. This is our last Sun and Star program of the semester and also our last Tower Center program. We're excited to have you all here today. I just want to say thank you so much for being here. We will resume programming back in January of 2022. But in the meantime, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, who many of you all know, Hiroki Takeuchi. Hiroki is a senior fellow at the Tower Center. He's the director of the Sun and Star program on Japan and East Asia. He's an associate professor at SMU and the director of undergraduate studies of political science. Hiroki, I will now turn it over to you to introduce our distinguished speaker.
All right, thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for attending the SunStar webinar series. This is the last event of the Tower Center this semester and also a SunStar webinar series. So I'd like to thank Bora, Jenny, Ray, Emma, and Luisa, Tower Center staffs, for making this webinar series possible. Also, I appreciate the partnership with Japan Metal Society Dallas-Fort Worth. But lastly, but not least importantly, on behalf of SMU, I thank Japan Airlines for their generous support for SMU Tower Center and the SMU in Japan program at Kansai Gakuin University. Thank you very much for your support. Today, we have the best person I can think of to wrap up this semester's discussion of SunStar webinar series on Japan and East Asia. I'm delighted to introduce my senpai, which means a senior colleague of studies of Japanese politics, Dr. Mireya Solis. Dr. Solis is the director of Center for East Asia Policy Studies and Knight Chair of Japanese Studies at Brookings Institution. She is the author of the most recent book, is The Dilemma of the Trading Nation, Japan and the United States in the Evolving Asia-Pacific Order, from which I learned a lot. And what motivated me a lot to really I would like to invite her to this webinar was the article that she wrote last November in Foreign Affairs. The title, this is actually a very interesting title, The Underappreciated Power, Japan After Abe. She has been writing a lot about numerous articles, writing about the changing roles that Japan plays in international politics, and more importantly, I would say, changing expected role that Japan should play in international politics. So please join me for welcoming Dr. Mireya Solis.
Thank you very much, Hiroki-san, for that very kind and generous introduction. And It is a pleasure to be joining all of you. Thanks also to the SMU and Tower Center for hosting me. And I realize this special occasion since it's the end of the semester, so I appreciate the opportunity. And I think I would like to keep these really conversational and then just speak for 20 minutes or so to give you a little bit of my thoughts on what role I see Japan playing in international economic statecraft, and then open it up for your comments and your questions. And one way I would like to summarize the main point I would like to convey is that I see Japan facing a really profound dilemma, and I'll explain as I go. But in essence, I would say that Japan has really elevated its international stature by kicking into high gear its economic internationalism and becoming a champion of connectivity. But that increasingly Japan, like other players in the region, are operating in a world economy that appears more rife with tension, where fragmentation is a constant concern, and therefore how to recalibrate Japan's economic statecraft is now, I think, foremost in the minds of Japanese policymakers, and what kind of relationship to keep with China, which is obviously a very large market, the top trading partner of Japan, but also a country that is more assertive in the region and where there are significant tensions, and what kind of, how to nurture the alliance with the United States now that the region is changing and the U.S. international role is changing as well. So there's a lot in flux, but main point is that I see a more proactive, a more consequential Japan, and that when we talk about economic statecraft, this is actually a very strong suit of Japan. These are where the country has strong assets, and I think that it has played them well. But it's not an easy proposition, as I said before, because it's a more constrained international environment. So then let me put a little bit of detail into this top line message and walk you through what I think Japan has done to elevate its profile, its influence, and what are the new challenges. And then I'll leave it at there and welcome your comments and questions. So, you know, over the past decade or 15 years, there really has been an uptick in Japanese foreign economic diplomacy. And I think that one main objective has been to promote economic interdependence, to encourage regional connectivity, and that there were very specific objectives in mind in doing this. One, of course, was to propel the Japanese economy at a time when Japan is facing population decline, the internal market is shrinking. It has become all the more important for Japan to remain a networked economy, to retain access to overseas markets. Japan, Tokyo is also very cognizant of the fact that in doing so, it's possible to gain influence in defining the rules of economic integration and in nurturing deeper collaboration with some of the countries in the region. And I think that if you look at then what the connectivity agenda has been for Japan in the past 15 years, I would say the record is actually quite impressive. A lot has been accomplished, and nothing that really resembles the more passive defensive role that we had been accustomed to see Japan play, especially in the area of trade. So over this period of time, Japan has been the architect, has been central to the creation of three, not just one, but three mega trade agreements. The Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the agreement with the European Union, and also more recently, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is an agreement of 15 countries that includes China, South Korea, many ASEAN nations, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. Notably not India, but that's something that we can discuss later. So on trade, Japan is actually playing the big leagues. These are some of the most important trade agreements, and Japan has been an important actor in making them come true. Another area where Tokyo has been very proactive is in infrastructure investment, in financing large-scale infrastructural projects in the developing world. And even though China has captured the limelight, China makes all the headlines with the Belt and Road Initiative. If you look at Japanese finance of infrastructure in Southeast Asia and other parts, Japan actually has a very, very strong record. And if you think about infrastructure finance as a competition, as a race, I think that the race is really between China and Japan. The United States and other countries offer a much more modest amount of capital to these endeavors. And another area where Tokyo has become very proactive is a critical one, and that is the digital economy. And therefore, Tokyo has labeled initiatives like data, free flow of data with trust. It's a co-convener of the WTO e-commerce negotiations, and has helped codify some of the most important rules on digital economy in the CPTPP, but also in the bilateral trade agreement between Japan and the United States. So far, it all sounds great. It was hard to get there. It's not smooth sailing, but the environment is changing. And I think that we are now in a world economy where trade protectionism, economic nationalism is on the rise, and where the two largest economies in the world, China and the United States, see each other now as competitors. They're closely intertwined, but they're trying to redefine the parameters of the relationship. And there have been a lot of tension, especially during the period of the tariff wars, and certainly when it comes to tech competition. And that's not abating. The restrictions to try to stem the flow of critical technology that are here to stay, I think, for a very long time. And then add to that, of course, the pandemic shock, the disruptions that have come from lockdowns, again, the voices arguing that we should bring production to the homeland, that onshoring will make us more secure. Those voices have become more influential, and that changes, I think, the international environment. And it's within this context that a new track of Japanese economic statecraft has now emerged. And it's not a surprise that Prime Minister Kishida has elevated this as one of the central priorities for his administration. And what I mean, what I have in mind here is what we refer to as economic security. And when you think about economic security, and I'll say more as I go, but in general, we're talking about, I think, how you manage the risks of economic interdependence, how you create resilience, and how you defend critical infrastructure, defend critical technology. So instead of promoting connectivity, it's a little bit about hedging on that connectivity. And I think this does create some tension in two very important tracks of Japanese economic statecraft. And it's not just Japan. I would say that every government today is confronted with the need to strike a balance and the need to reconcile these two tracks of economic diplomacy. Now, I'll just give you a little more on what Japan has been doing on trade, and also what can I expect to see Japan doing on economic security. What are the early manifestations of this? And end with some reflections as to what this means for Japan's international role. And I can certainly speak more about infrastructure finance, but I find that if I do that, I may end up using all my time. So why don't I just stick with trade for now? There's plenty to cover there. And then I'll also bring in economic security. And again, it's really interesting because 2 decades ago, just at the beginning of the 21st century, the picture could not have been more different in the sense that actually the concern there, and this was an acutely felt concern, was that Japan was going to be left behind. That Japan, because of its own domestic political constraints, because the agricultural lobby was objecting to any large-scale liberalization, because the bureaucracy was very divided, because you did not have top-down executive leadership and a strong prime ministerial figure that could reconcile these different interests, that Japan could not negotiate with ambition, and therefore that Japan would remain punching below its weight. And therefore you had, a very large world economy that was not partaking in what was really a very important trend, and that was a negotiation of preferential trade agreements. And that was the discussion, if you will, 20 or so years ago. Now think about how much things have changed. If we use the vantage point of today, Japan has something like 21 free trade agreements under its belt that cover close to 80% of its trade. So clearly Japan is no longer at risk of being marginalized. Japan is at the forefront of this trend. But not all trade agreements are the same. When I say 21, some matter more than others. That's natural. And I would say, and Hiroki kindly made reference to my book, Dilemmas of a Trading Nation, that really focuses a lot on the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement, because I feel that that agreement really made Japan. It was the trial by fire, if you will, the critical test that really elevated Japan to this new role. And I think that's interesting because my impression is that many observers have been making the wrong bets about Japan and the TPP for a very long time. I remember when Prime Minister Abe came to Washington in 2013 to discuss with President Obama whether Japan could make it. Japan was the last entrant into the TPP. The door appeared like it was closing. And I remember that a lot of people were reluctant to see Japan join, despite the fact that we're talking about the third largest economy in the world. And the idea then was that Japan, again, if Japan joined, it would drag its feet, it would not embark on genuine liberalization, it could not come to decisions quickly, and therefore it would put at risk the ability to close with, in good time, the TPP negotiations. And this was actually a very wrong assessment of how Japan negotiated the TPP, because when Japan joined, actually, for the first time, it was able to speak with a unified voice. The government created for the first time a TPP negotiation headquarters to try to avoid the legendary divisions among the bureaucracies. And therefore, when he joined the TPP negotiations, actually was well prepared. And sure enough, Japan, of course, did not go as far as other countries when it comes to agricultural liberalization. Japan was the country that opened agriculture the least, but it was enough so that it would not be an unsurmountable objective to close the negotiations. And the other very important element in the way in which Japan negotiated was that it had great ambition when it came to the rules part of the negotiations, and actually a lot of convergence of interest between the United States and Japan on drafting these rules on disciplines for state-owned enterprises, intellectual property, e-commerce, digital economy, you name it. So the US position was actually strengthened when Japan entered the TPP negotiations. But the second wrong bet that many made about Japan and the TPP, or the TPP more generally, is that many assume that when President Trump announced that the United States was leaving the TPP, that the TPP was dead, that it could not be rescued. And if you think about it, it was not unusual to think that, because you had the leading economy leading the agreement, and that obviously was a huge blow. And I think that it was Japan working with the other 10 remaining countries that in rescuing the TPP that cemented Japan's international leadership role. And they actually carried out these negotiations with skill. They rescued the TPP with great skill. First of all, because they decided that they would not reopen the tariff negotiations, because that would be the Pandora box. And to stitch back the agreement, had they done that, I think would have proven impossible. But also because they decided to be very, very cautious in making changes to the rules. And they really just went with a surgical approach and decided to suspend in very limited way 22 provisions on intellectual property mostly that had been strong preference of the United States, but were not popular among the other TPP countries. And with that, it was possible to get the TPP to have a second lease of life in what we now know as a CPTPP. Now we enter now a new stage for the CPTPP, and I'd be happy to discuss further. I imagine this might be something that during the Q&A there may be a lot of interest. But now it's the question about the enlargement of the CPTPP, and countries are now knocking on the door, like the UK, for example, has been the first one to solicit entry. But now there are new applications have arrived. Just last month, China, and then 6 days later, Taiwan. And this then opens a host of questions. First of all, I think that it goes to underscore how far apart the United States is from the center of action in deciding what shape the regional architecture is going to take, because the United States is no longer a member of TPP, does not really have a voice or vote on what happens with these applications. And there's a very heated debate as to whether China can join, should join, and what that would mean for the CPTPP. My view is that I don't think that China is ready today to really live by some of the standards of the CPTPP, that if anything, over the past few years, China's state control of the economy has intensified, certainly when it comes to the role of state-owned enterprises. And also China's barriers to the free flow of data have intensified quite markedly in the past few years. And again, that this might run counter the desire of the CPTPP to promote freedom of data flows. But it's possible that China will try to get some exemptions to these rules. And the question now that's front and center for the CPTPP countries is what to do with this. And this is not going to be, this is not something that's going to be solved anytime soon. I imagine that this will take a very, very long time. And the fact that Taiwan is also seeking membership, and the Taiwanese economy is certainly closer to the, in meeting the standards of the CPTPP, but then the geopolitical consideration weighs in. And I would also note that for accession to happen, it must be by consensus. So this will require the assent of all members of the CPTPP who have ratified the agreement. So this, I think, shifts the importance of the CPTPP. It elevates it. It puts it really at the front of what's happening in terms of the geoeconomics and the geopolitics of the region. And Japan, obviously, and the other countries now are faced with a very significant challenge. There's a desire to grow the CPTPP, but not in a way in which it undermines the standards of the agreement, but also then how to navigate relations with China looms large. Now, let me just say a word on, because I think I'm, Hiroki-san, please let me know if I'm going on too long, but let me say a word on the economic security track, because this, I think, is really a fundamental shift affecting not just Japan, but many other countries, including the United States. So, you know, just to recap a point I made before, I think that, you know, these concern about managing the risks of economic interdependence, on strengthening the defensive measures on how to protect the flow of technology, how to protect supply chains, how to protect infrastructure and so forth, really is a result of three very large scale forces that have now manifested simultaneously. As I mentioned before, I think that we have now moved to a system, a situation of great power competition between China and the United States. And that means that countries are very focused on relative gains, and you know, who's going to benefit more from this economic interdependence. And therefore there is this very different take on how to evaluate the merits of the relationship. The second one is the technological revolution that we're going through with new technologies, changing the way in which economies and societies operate, but also with implications for military readiness. So some people refer to these technologies as platform technologies because they're central to economic competitiveness and military readiness. What I have in mind here is AI, 5G, quantum computing, the most advanced chips, semiconductor manufacturing, biotechnology, you name it. And lastly, of course, what I mentioned was COVID-19 and the fact that this has then increased the appeal of bringing back production and export economic nationalism on the rise. Now, I think that now it's very common to hear many governments when they articulate their foreign economic policy to talk about more and more about self-reliance. But I think it's important to note that at least when I read the documents saying the United States, China, and Japan, I don't really see a play for autarky, of isolation, because that actually decreases national power. I think that if you look at some of the documents that are coming out just at, I think we're in the beginning of this shift, but certainly in Japan, we begin to see some policy documents that talk about the new direction of economic security. I think that there are two concepts that to me really capture what this is going to be about in terms of the approach. And of course, we need to see how this is implemented. But there are two main concepts that we are now hearing more and more of. One is the notion of strategic autonomy. And by this, I think the idea is to eliminate excessive dependencies on foreign economies and foreign powers, to make sure that the basic functions of economy and society can go on, and therefore that you have secure an industrial base, and a number of services that are critical to the operation of a country. And the second one is a really interesting one, the concept of a strategic indispensability. And here, the idea is that there's a desire to be at the cutting edge, to be at the technological frontier, so that other countries depend on you. And this is seen as an avenue for influence. And therefore, I think that there's a premium again on strengthening the production of technology, strengthening the industrial base. And, we see the manifestation of economic security in Japan in many different ways. Last year, for example, an economic security team was added to the National Security Secretariat. Same was true at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. We have now seen some of the first steps in trying to strengthen the shield, if I may use that metaphor. And therefore, there has been a review of the foreign exchange and foreign trade control law, so that Japan now has tightened its screening of foreign direct investment with a national security logic in place. Another measure is supply chain resilience, and there's been a lot of focus on this subsidy program that was launched in the middle of the pandemic to try to avoid overdependence on some countries, aka China, and therefore that Japanese companies could receive subsidies to bring back some production or to diversify into Southeast Asia. And it's interesting when you look at, I think that something like $3.1 billion have been allocated the last time I looked. If you look at the industrial breakdown of which companies are receiving the subsidies, very interesting. It's not just personal protection equipment, medical supplies that you think would be affected by the pandemic, but also some of the products and industries that are at the center of the U.S. China tech competition, and they have to do with the semiconductor production, advanced chemicals, the processing of rare earth materials, and so forth. But it's very important to understand that Japan has no desire of decoupling from China. This should be seen as a hedging strategy. The stock of Japanese investment in China runs close to, I think, $130 billion. So $3.1 billion is not going to dislodge the economy. There's no appetite or desire to do that, but there's a desire to try to help Japanese companies navigate the intensified risks that foreign production conveys. And just to, in case there's interest, I think that one of the most recent developments on economic security has to do with semiconductor manufacturing. And here I would just say, with a desire to hopefully encourage more discussion on this, that many people assume that Japan has been dethroned. Japan used to be a dominant player in the semiconductor industry that actually created a lot of tension in U.S.-Japan relations in the mid-1980s to mid-1990s. And it's true that Japan no longer captures those large shares of global sales, but the semiconductor supply chain is extremely complex. There are many, many nodes, many segments to them. And many Japanese companies actually are dominant in some of these segments of the supply chain, especially when we think about advanced materials like chemicals, or production equipment like lithography equipment. Japanese companies are very important. And just to give you, I think this captures the atmosphere of the times. They're referred to also as choke point technologies. Just that tells you that having that dominance in a specific segments of the supply chain gives you some leverage. But Japan does not produce the most advanced semiconductors, and there's a huge shortage of semiconductors for the automobile industry. Toyota, for example, has had to severely restrict its production. These are not the most advanced chips, they're the intermediate range. And it's been interesting to watch that the Japanese government now is talking, like the American government, about providing subsidies to bring firms like TSMC to Japan, and there's an announcement that may be on the works. So note of caution here, I think, is that we seem to be now moving to a world, because of economic security, where industrial policy is making a comeback. And to some extent, the efforts to boost resilience and address the shortages are imperative. But on the other hand, we should tread with caution in the sense of not embarking on a subsidy race that could actually diminish cohesion among the allies. So why don't I stop here and then welcome your comments and questions.
Okay, thank you very much. That was great. A lot of things to discuss. So a few questions have already been coming in, but if you have any question or anything that you want to discuss, please write them in the Q&A box, and I will try to incorporate those questions and comments into my discussion with Mireya. I would like to start with talking about op-ed article you wrote just after Trump withdrew United States from TPP, and then many people, actually including myself, thought TPP was dead. And I think you wrote that Japan, this is actually the opportunity that Japan should pick up to play the leadership role to revive the TPP. And then you said like the comments, feedback to that op-ed article was mostly negative, and that's impossible, those things. So one of the questions coming from our student, Lexi Aid, said, so basically, she cites actually my article, but anyway, so Japan is going to rise as both an economic and political leader Is the CPTPP indicative of a change in Japan's economic diplomacy, particularly in the Pacific? I think you thought about, basically that's yes. And so my question is, what would be the major challenge or obstacle for Japan to play active role as a leader of the international liberal order, especially international economic liberal order?
Well, thank you. That's a really important question. So I'll give it a try, and I'm sure I'm going to leave a lot out. But let me just start with the op-ed you mentioned, because I wrote this, I think, in November of 2016, right after the presidential election, because it was very clear by then, given how much trade figured in the platform of then-elect President Trump, that this was going to happen, that the United States was going to leave. And it's, the subtitle of that op-ed was "The TPP is dead, long live the TPP." And by that, I meant that the United States was out, but that the TPP actually could be rescued by just, first of all, one early way to make sure this was viable is to change the ratification rules, because they had been written in a way, negotiators are very savvy, that it could not go forward if the United States did not ratify. So it was just, I offered a very simple fix, just fix that, and then let the remaining countries go forward. And again, I counseled against making major changes to the agreement out of fear that it would quickly collapse. But the point I was making, and then I think this ties into your broader question about the role of Japan in the liberal international order and what the challenges to that are, that I believe that the TPP acquired a new meaning in a way that it was possible for middle powers to cooperate to ensure that rules-based trade did not become a casualty to economic nationalism, to great power competition, to a globalization backlash. And therefore, that this became a way, I think, for these countries that do benefit and have benefited tremendously from open markets to make sure that closure would not be the ultimate outcome, especially when you consider that the WTO has suffered for a very long time from a stagnation in its negotiation function, and now more recently, the fact that its trade enforcement function has come to a halt. So this leaves middle powers, open economies, limited options and choices on how you then make sure that free trade continues, and therefore that this was a strategic bet. Now, but I think that this is just a larger, just one of the elements in which Japan has made contributions to the liberal international order. The other one I mentioned was infrastructure finance. And again, Japan has, Japan started investing in infrastructure long before the Belt and Road initiative. But I do think that having that competition with China spurred Japan to step up its game and then develop this quality infrastructure set of standards, where the idea is to devise, financing for these important projects in a way in which, first of all, they're sustainable financially. They will not contribute to debt overhang. There will be transparency in procurement, and there will be a number of standards that ensure that it's a sound proposition, because you don't want to be encouraging developing countries to acquire debt that they could no longer repay down the line. So that's another contribution to, I think, the liberal international order. And I think also, but it's not circumscribed only to that. Again, very interestingly, Japan has now coined a blueprint, a vision for regional integration, the free and open Indo-Pacific, with some of the key principles there are, rule of law, connectivity, and democratic values. And it's interesting to me to see that a concept that originated in Japan now has become a reference and has influenced the way in which many countries in the region are articulating their views on what should be the desired vision. And the United States has, incorporated its own free and open Indo-Pacific. There will be variations in how each government fleshes this out, but I think you can begin again to see Japanese influence in very important ways that, quite frankly, we did not see in the past. Now, to answer your question, what are some of the challenges? Well, again, it's difficult for Japan to navigate an international system where zero-sum becomes the dynamic. And, Japanese companies have suffered a great deal. They have been collateral, if you will, to the tariff war, to the tech restrictions that are being applied. So I think that one of the risks here is that the certainty and the predictability of the rules of the game is eroded, and there's only so much that Japan can do to try to bring greater certainty. And I think that that's a concern. I think that there is a lot of discussion in Tokyo about what is the right China policy, how much Japan should push back on Chinese assertive behavior, how much it should actually continue to promote economic integration. And I think that I see different voices, different views being articulated, but I think that there is growing concern about the role that China is playing in the region. And I also think that it's a challenge for Japan in the sense that the United States role has also become unpredictable. And after all, Japan, I mentioned economic statecraft is Japan's strong suit. It has, done more on security policy, has diversified its partnerships. It has been a proponent of the Quad, now has closer security cooperation with other countries besides the United States. But at the end of the day, Japan depends on the security alliance with the United States, with the protection of that nuclear umbrella. And the fact that there's no clarity as to what direction the United States will take, that there is a lot of change between one administration to the next, that I think also undermines Japan's own leadership role in the international liberal order.
Yeah, that's interesting. My image is like Japan was like pushed to the center of the stage of international politics. So I'm not sure how much Japanese people or those like politicians, practitioners who are involved in the policy making of Japan realize like how much expectation Japan receives. So that's actually, I always think that that's actually very interesting. Let's talk about one big question about whether United States is back to the CPTPP. And Kiri McNamee, our student actually who read your book, asked that question. And actually, this is actually related to what I have been thinking for a long time. And then one time in the discussion, I asked this question to the speaker, and then somebody that is, it's not you, but somebody else who is from Washington, D.C. said, so my question was, which one is more likely, like China joining CPTPP or US coming back to TPP? And then my expectation was US coming back to TPP would be much easier and more likely. But that person from DC answered that actually probably China joining TPP is more likely considering the current atmosphere, political climate of Washington, DC. And then I felt really scared actually. So, so how do you think about, now China also actually applies to TPP membership. And then the United States, also we are actually I think that Japan and then other countries, and then also many people are who are involved in trade politics, really like want the United States to be back to TPP. So how do you think about the kind of likelihood and then the implications of China and the U.S. membership of TPP?
Thank you, Hiroki. That's a great question. And, I've always felt that the United States leaving the TPP was really a strategic mistake, because if we're really serious about competing with China or trying to shape some of China's behavior and trying to create an incentive structure that the United States would be more influential inside the TPP and not outside. And in my book, the point I make is that where we went astray is that we actually did not really develop the domestic support measures to help people cope with economic change, not just trade, but technological shifts. So I think that having left the TPP, we have surrendered a wonderful instrument that we had, and we also have lost a lot of credibility. And I know that the Biden administration has a focus on a workers-oriented trade policy, and that they also are talking a lot about working with allies. But, and of course, they have also stated that they're not ready to move on trade agreements until they have laid down the foundations for domestic policy. And we all know that the legislative battle is still ongoing. The infrastructure bill passed, but there's another important large bill where a lot of the safety net measures are comprised. And therefore, what I'm trying to say is that this is not being a proactive, an administration that's proactive on trade. And I think that's very clear. It took 9 months for the administration to do a review of its China trade policy. And despite all the expectations, there was no new announcement of a major new approach, but basically just to see through the implementation of the phase 1 trade agreement. And there's been no real signaling that they're prepared to consider joining the CPTPP. We don't have now trade promotion authorities, so a major negotiation like this would be a heavy lift. But that doesn't mean that we could not do something that, again, re-engages the United States with the region and could be a preparatory step towards an eventual CPTPP accession, if that's not possible today. And what I have in mind is a digital trade agreement, for example. That has also been slow moving. I understand that there's been a lot of discussion, interagency discussions about whether this should be the way to go, but we don't have yet any clue or indication. This is an important week, I should note, because the APEC Leader Summit is happening in a couple of days. And it would be interesting to see if that would be a time when, perhaps the Indo-Pacific strategy is revealed and where there's actually an economic component to it, because I think it has become very clear that one of the big weaknesses in our Asia policy is that we do not have economic engagement as part of it. So, I'm not optimistic about the US returning soon, but I'm hoping that at least with a digital initiative that we could begin to make some headway. Because you see, China has applied to the CPTPP, but also just a week and a half or two ago, it also applied to the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement. And, my recommendation had been that Japan and the United States should also join this agreement And what's interesting to me is that China is joining or trying to join CPTPP and DEPA, that's what this agreement is called, which are agreements that in principle endorse the freedom of data flows, whereas in fact, China is not a practitioner of freedom of data flows. And, RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, does have language on freedom of data flows, but none of the commitments are enforceable. And there is a huge national security exemption that allows easily for government to say, I cannot let this data go across the border because I feel that there's a national security risk. So my concern is that what China might be doing is, first of all, to maneuver skillfully in a way in which, even though it continues to practice digital protectionism, it can try and find its way into these agreements that have a very different objective in mind by seeking exemptions, by seeking non-enforceable rules. So it really is up to these countries like Canada, Australia, Japan, and the other CPT countries to decide if those are rules that they want to fight for, and therefore that should be a line that cannot be crossed, or not. Again, I think that that's where a digital agreement with the United States now could actually make a difference in strengthening the resolve to try to uphold those digital economy principles.
Thank you. A few people asked the question regarding the climate change, and this is another hot area. And well, one big question is whether Japan can also play a leadership role in this area. And then probably it's fair to say that compared with the field of trade, it's less promising. And so what do you think is your perspective of the Japan's role leading climate change, and especially like one thing that I would like to throw in is Japanese, I think, government or Japanese companies actually invest in coal-fired plant in the developing countries, and then Japanese argument is basically that is actually cleaner coal-fired plant, and then it's cheap. So as a result, so the developing countries are more easily transferring from current coal-fired plant to a cleaner coal-fired plant, and then that will contribute to reducing the CO2 emission. So that's actually Japan's argument, but I don't think it's popular argument in the world. And so Japan is now like almost labeled that it's such a very much like turning away from the active role in the leadership role of the climate change. So how do you think about Japan's role in the climate change issue?
Thank you. I mean, I think that this is not an area where Japan has been at the forefront, where Japan has led the way. I think that Japan now has made some interesting and more ambitious pledges towards decarbonization, but they're of recent vintage, right? I think that Abenomics, for example, the economic revitalization strategy, did not really embrace climate change. And it was only when Prime Minister Suga, the successor to Prime Minister Abe, that made the greening of Japan, in addition to the digitization of Japan, a key priority. And I think that the objectives now, I think that they keep being revised and they become more ambitious, what Japan is pledging to do. The question is, how will it be able to deliver on them? And again, this is a recent development, so it's hard to say, but just some, and I'm not an expert in energy policy, but just some general comments, I think, are that for Japan to be able to accomplish these climate change objectives, then immediately is, well, what is the right energy mix for Japan? I think that becomes the obligatory question. And it's a very loaded question in Japan, as you know well, Hiroki, because it used to be the case that the idea was for policymakers and energy planners in Japan, the idea had been that nuclear power would be an important component of the energy mix. And it used to be that people were saying that it would be almost like a third of the energy supply would come from nuclear power plants. But then 3/11 happened, the really strong earthquake of March 2011 that generated a tsunami, and then the nuclear accident in Fukushima. And that obviously created a lot of fear in society about nuclear power. And the reactors were stopped for safety checks, and only a few have been restarted. And that resulted in Japan relying more and more on fossil fuels. And the promotion of renewables has been challenging. So it was interesting, again, Japan just had a general election, as you well know, Hiroki, and there were many issues discussed. And one of them that figured there was how the candidates felt about nuclear power. And I think that what will be important to watch going forward, a number of items. One is, could Japan make faster progress in developing renewables? Second, what will be the role of nuclear power? Can greater social tolerance to the reliance on nuclear power be achieved or not? And last, going to your point about the coal power plants, what I think has been very interesting there is that I believe that Japan has now made the commitment that they will no longer open they will no longer finance new coal power plants in the developing world. So that does seem to be, and I believe that then later China also has made a similar commitment. So that I think is an interesting new development. But I think that we're now in the midst of COP26, and whether there can be meaningful commitments. I think that of course we see countries having a declaratory policy with ambitious commitments. Getting there is obviously very complicated, but the development on coal power plants, I think it's noteworthy, and I think that there is an unfinished national conversation in Japan about energy supply.
Okay, thank you. Great. I'd like to bundle a few questions, and then this is actually the last comment that I asked you to give. So, one specific question from Kristen Bekasi is the issue of so-called export control with South Korea, and is this kind of part of economic security or something else? Maybe it's domestic politics. And then related, but I think that's a kind of different question. Like Yoshimura-san of Sumitomo Corporation asked the export control. And then, so are we going back to the era of plurilateral export control regime like COCOM? Well, especially the current like U.S. China trade war. Export control regime is a question. And then finally, one big question that I'd like to ask is, talk about economic security and then like focusing on security side. Now we seem to have a kind of agreement that Taiwan Straits is the most important security concern. And there are a few various aspects. We rely on the supply of semiconductor products in the Taiwan Strait. That's actually, that one thing would be a very big issue. And then like, of course, so economy and security, they are related to each other. So how do you think about the Taiwan Straits? What is your perspective? So that's actually the last question that I'd like to.
And a very small question, right? to end with. This are three terrific questions. You know, the export control dispute between Japan and South Korea, and the direction of export controls more broadly, and then stability and the cross straits, and if there's a rethink in Japan or not about that. You know, I think that I see the export control role really guided by bilateral relations as opposed to the broader economic security trend, but it does have implications for that, and I'll make sure to try to elaborate them. So in case people are not familiar with this, I think it was the summer of 2019, the Japanese government decided to tighten the export controls on 3 essential chemicals, which I refer to as choke points, that South Korean firms rely on for the production of semiconductors. And then they also moved to delist South Korea from the white list, which gives expedited approval for sensitive materials. And South Korea then reciprocated in kind and delisted Japan, and actually even threatened to eliminate an intelligence information sharing agreement. So things got pretty difficult between the two. And this happened in a context in which there was, this relates to court cases in South Korea that address forced labor during wartime. So again, going back, the echoes of history very much present today, creating a climate of tension between the two countries, and then now manifested in the cutting edge of manufacturing semiconductors and advanced materials. And so I don't think that this was yet part of the economic security trend, but it does, you know, very much speak about the use of economic tools. And I think that the other lesson I would draw from here is, and I feel that I always try to emphasize this, is that, you know, people are talking about weaponized economic interdependence, about choke point technologies and so forth. But it's important to know that if you decide to exercise that leverage, there's also a cost attached to you, in the sense that what we saw in the Japan-South Korea dispute was that many South Korean companies then resorted, by trying to develop different suppliers, by trying to source domestically or through others, and therefore some Japanese companies actually lost market share. So, you know, my point is that, yes, the supply chains are built on trust and interdependence. And if that trust erodes, then there's going to be an adjustment. And that means that it's not just one party who loses, because these are important business relations. On the question of Randy Yoshimura on export control and where are we heading towards, that I believe that this is going to be a focus of the new national security. And I forgot to mention in my presentation that the Kishida administration has said that they're now going to move towards drafting a general act on economic security measures. And, you know, we'll see how far this goes. It will be a whole of government undertaking. And my understanding is that a review of the entirety of the export control regime might be in place. But the question here is whether we'll have strengthened multilateral export controls, or whether we'll actually have countries going their own separate way, or coordinating with allies their administration of their export controls more closely. My intuition tells me that it might be the latter and not the former. And then Hiroki-san, your question about Taiwan Straits. Again, very interesting to watch when Prime Minister Suga came to Washington in April, and there was that joint leader statement that there was a very explicit language added as to how much the stability of the Taiwan Strait matters to Japan's security. I think that now that the situation has deteriorated and that China has become more assertive with incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone and other forms of harassment, this has become a more serious concern. And I think it's understood that Japan's security would most likely be right away, it would be affected right away because of the presence of American troops in Japan and just the geographical proximity. So a contingency there most likely would have huge repercussions for Japan. So, Japan has not changed its policy of, unofficial relations with Taiwan. But what has changed perhaps is the willingness of Japanese politicians and policymakers to more explicitly discuss how much Taiwan security also matters to Japan's security. And I think that's an important change, and one that reflects, again, this deteriorating regional environment for Japan.
So how do you think of the perspective of Taiwan's membership of the TPP?
Because it's consensus, I feel that many of the current CPTPP countries would be very concerned about the punishment that would be delivered by China. I think that China is not a member, but it already is telling existing CPTPP countries that they should not really move forward with the Taiwanese application. Taiwan obviously has the right to request application as a separate customs territory. It's part of WTO, part of APEC, has trade agreements with some CPTPP countries. I think it was interesting to watch the tone of, say, Foreign Minister Motegi and other policymakers who received warmly Taiwan's application. But obviously, again, because it only takes one to spoil the process, I find that it's not going to be easy. But I think that it would be important, again, to try to flesh out this process as much as possible. And I think Taiwan they've been doing their homework for many years. This is a high priority for them. To be able to show that they are on par and that they can meet the standards would be very beneficial. And you asked me about how the U.S. could do something useful. I think that launching a trade negotiation with Taiwan, separate from CPTPP, would actually be very, very beneficial to Taiwan.
Okay, thank you very much. There are so many issues, and we can talk about Japan's economic strategy, and then implications on world politics, especially Asia Pacific. We can talk about this forever, but well, thank you very much, Mireya, for such a powerful presentation and very informative. By the way, are you optimistic for 2022?
I am optimistic. I want to think that we are thinking now perhaps of recovery on a more sustainable basis. I understand that there's large swaths of the world that still remain to be vaccinated, but I'm hoping that vaccines have made such a difference, and I think that the more we move towards getting past the pandemic, I think that gives me some hope.
Yeah, I'm also optimistic, so that's great. Thank you very much. So please join me for thanking Dr. Solis.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Hiroki, and thank you so much, Dr. Solis. This was a great conversation. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. We look forward to seeing you all in 2022. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Have a good evening and good
Have a
morning.
nice evening. Have a nice day. Or in Japan.